let me just back up a little bit before I talk about the book, though, and just briefly mention that my interest in experiences started because I grew up in an experience family. I did not work at a theme park, as many of the speakers have talked about, but I worked very much in experiential industry. My family, in fact, my father still operates a whitewater rafting company, and I grew up guiding multi-day whitewater rafting trips up in Idaho and in California, mainly up in Idaho on the main Salmon and Middle Fork rivers. And I would see people, even as a teenager, because I started guiding when I was about 14, people come from all over the world on these trips. And as a teenager, I noticed how relationships changed over a couple of day period and how people's behavior changed. And from a pragmatic perspective, I was curious about why this change was occurring, how we could provide better experiences on our trips. But that question of, was it the setting, was it the activities, was it being away from regular everyday society, was that what was affecting change? Those questions are what continually driven me as an academic and a teacher, just as an individual. I'm interested in experiences where change occurs. And loved hearing from Joe and others talk about the topic of transformation. And so, Bob and I overlapped a little bit when I was a grad student at Texas A&M University, 2008 or so. I was teaching a class on leisure programming as a graduate student using a book that Bob had written, and he came in to teach for a couple of years after he had retired as a dean at another institution. Anyways, it was great. I could ask Bob about his book and how to teach certain parts, and enjoyed his mentoring. And then about 10 years later, fast forward, I'm at Brigham Young University. We're working on developing and launching a program called Experience Design and Management. And we were working to build out a curriculum that saw experience design as an umbrella set of competencies and frameworks that you would then apply in maybe more nuanced ways in particular contexts, whether that was patient experience or customer experience or themed entertainment experiences. And Bob said, hey, I'd be really interested in writing a book. I wrote a book particularly on leisure contexts, but writing a book about how do you just design experiences irregardless of context, right? What are sort of universal approaches to designing experiences? That sort of launched our collaboration in writing the book. We felt like there was great work out there, such as the experience economy, and other work talking about examples of great experiences and how experiences were driving the economy and what different companies were doing. But we really wanted to be able to articulate a process, right? How do you actually go about then designing experience, especially if you don't have the budget of an Apple or Ritz-Carlton or Disney, right? What's the process of just designing experiences? And so I want to just walk you through our thinking a little bit on this. And we started with defining key terms, right? I think it's important to be able to define something if you're going to then try to design it. And especially when we're talking about experiences, it's one thing to say, design a chair, this tangible object, right? And it's another thing to say design an experience, because experiences are complex. And although we're all having the same shared experience here in this room, we'll each walk away with a unique experience because we're unique individuals. And as Joe was talking about this morning, it's what actually happens within the individual as they consume and process and think about the experience that actually matters. So we define experiences as a unique interactional phenomenon resulting from conscious awareness and reflective interpretations of experience elements that is sustained by a participant, culminating in personally perceived results and memories. So there's a lot in there, but experiences are complex, and they don't occur until somebody pays attention to these experience elements that I'm going to talk about here in just a little bit, and pays attention for long enough that they walk away saying, like, that was an experience with a clear beginning, middle, and end. So then experience design we define as the process of intentionally orchestrating experience elements to provide opportunities for participants to co-create and sustain interactions that lead to results desired by the participant and the designer. So as a designer, I can orchestrate elements, I can create attention to and respond to in a way where what they get out of it is something that they desire, and the way they tell stories about the experience is something that I would hope this is how they would describe the experience. So after defining those key terms, we also went about unpacking experiences just a little bit more, right? Because it's one thing to say everything is an experience. Joe referenced this morning as well. But that doesn't really help us in terms of actually defining experiences. And so the first piece was trying to suggest a structure. So this is a visual from an article that I wrote with Peter Ward and Patty Freeman, some of my colleagues back in 2015, which is trying to suggest a structure of what an experience is, right? So in the left-hand corner here, we have the participant or the guest or whomever is having the experience, and that they are interacting with elements of an experience scape, right? So this interaction is within what produces the perceived results in an individual, right? I pay attention to a keynote, I pay attention to a conversation I have, I pay attention while I'm riding a ride, right? And then I walk away with the perceived results. And this interaction is these micro experiences are happening all the time, right? And we can break those down into, or we can combine them into a macro experience, right? So when you go on a ride, right, there's all of these touch points while you're in the queue, right? And then there's the touch points on the ride, and then there's the touch points or interactions after we leave, right? Making up this anticipation, participation, reflection, this macro experience. So all experiences have this structure of micro experiences and then macro experience. And as the designer, we've got to think about both of those levels, which I'll come back to this idea. But I want to briefly talk about experience-scape elements. So this is drawing from, in part from Irving Goffman, the sociologist's work, about what are the raw materials when we're designing an experience. And so we suggest there's these 6 categories, right? We call these the experience-scape elements. Just as if you were designing a landscape, you'd use grass and hardscaping and maybe some water features, right? So first is people. And this is, I think, most important, right? Because if there aren't people, an experience can't occur. It's not just the people who are participating, but it's the people that are providing the experience. You could even argue it's the people in social media talking about the experience, because those could be anticipation touch points for your guests coming into the experience. So the people. We have to think about what people are participating, how we train the people who are delivering the experience. We also have to think about the relationships between these people. Do they know each other? Do they need to know each other? Do they not need to know each other? Are there things that we want to do to sort of build community, or do we not have to worry about that? And of course, there's the place. This could be the physical place with all of its sensory elements. It could also be a digital space, right? It could also, the place in time matters as well. An experience in the morning versus the evening, the summer versus the winter, that can change the nature of the experience. So we think about these the place elements. The objects, these could be the physical objects in the experience, like tables and chairs here in this room, the screen up here. There's also symbolic objects, like logos that mean things, or different visuals that mean things to people. Then there's the rules of an experience, from social norms all the way up to federal regulations. There are industries, like professional sports leagues, that are in essence, when we boil it down to its most fundamental part, there's just a set of rules, right? And then the whole structure has been built up around rules. And then finally blocking, sort of this is a theater term, the movement of people and things through spaces. But when we're designing experiences, these are our raw materials. And we change one, and it can change the whole experience. Doing something inside versus outside, doing something with people you know versus strangers, changing the rules up just a little bit, and it changes the experience. So, the raw materials that we use. Then we also, going back to this idea that everything is an experience, yes, but there's different experience types, right? And so I want to hang out on this slide for just a little bit and unpack, because a lot of our thinking hangs out here. So in 2018, published an article with some colleagues at BYU proposing this sort of ordinary, extraordinary stack here that you see on the right side. And so when an individual pays attention to an experience, right? Attention is sort of this basic requirement for an experience to exist. And if that experience doesn't leave any type of lasting impact, it's just ordinary, right? So attention leads to ordinary experience. And most of the experiences we have in life are ordinary. And that's okay, right? There's every experience, if you think about the experiences we design as like an ecosystem of experiences, and some of those touch points are going to be ordinary, just functional. We're going to be providing services, and others are going to be extraordinary, right? So ordinary experience is attention. The next level up, memorable experiences are experiences where an emotion has been evoked. An emotion produces a memory, right? Our brain timestamps that moment, sort of pulls it out of the stream of consciousness and says, for whatever reason, this is important because you felt sad or happy or angry or elated, right? Now, if that leads to further reflection, and the reflection leads to some type of relevant insight, then that has become a meaningful experience. And then if the insight is further integrated and leads to change, this could be small t transformation, like an attitudinal change, or metamorphic change, like Joe talked about, like a capital T transformation that I think happens less frequently in our lives. That would then be seen as a transformative experience. So we proposed this model back in 2018, and then started doing measurement work so we could empirically test it. We had an article come out last year with the results of a number of studies. I think in that article we had 3 different studies where we developed some measures both in terms of scales, but also some single item measures to look at those impacts of emotion, insight, and change. And the first thing we found is when we went out and asked people after they experienced a variety of different experiences to indicate how they felt about the perceived emotions and insights and change, that when we looked at that data, the structure held up really, really well. It was, I think at least in this data set, it was like in 92 or 93% of the cases when somebody said, yes, I experienced change, I perceived that I experienced change in this experience, they would also indicate they had experienced insights and emotion, right? It was very, very rare for somebody to say that this changed me, but I didn't experience insights and emotion, or I just experienced emotion but no insight. But it really holds up. The other thing that we looked at was okay, what about other measures that we use to look at the impact of experience, right? A common one is Net Promoter Score, your likeliness to recommend, right? And so when we collected both NPS scores and used these experience type impact scales, somebody was much more likely to be a promoter if they had experienced emotion, insight, and change, right? And if we just look singular at the single scales and their mean scores and in correlation with their NPS, yes, emotion and insight were correlated with higher NPS scores, but change was most strongly correlated with change scores. And so while NPS is helpful because it provides an industry benchmark and you can sort of make comparisons, and yes, you can dig into the qualitative data, but it doesn't give you really design directives, whereas looking instead at emotion, insight, and change, you can look at those scores and say, yeah, we're not doing great on the insight. We could increase that, and that can be a way to increase NPS, because I think this is just how we, as humans, think about the experiences we have and what we value. I think we value inherently progress. We value feeling and gaining insights and experiencing change and progress in our life. And so this then allows us to do research thinking about these processes, right? This process of reflecting, which leads to insight and integration. And how do you do that? There's one thing to say, okay, we just want to keep people busy and provide sort of experience, emotion. But if there's no opportunity to unpack that emotion and reflect on it, it's really unlikely that something's going to move from memorable to meaningful. And if you just hang out in the memorable realm, it's less likely that people are going to say, like, yeah, you should go and do this thing, right? Or that they're going to want to come back and do it again, as opposed to like, oh, sort of like, check the box, I'm going to move on to sort of the next new experience. So then it comes to a process. Like, if you understand what experiences are, and different experience types, and sort of their raw materials, how do you go about designing them? And I won't spend a ton of time here. I think I'm sort of preaching to the choir when it comes to process. But we really feel that a human-centered design or a design thinking process is really important because we're designing for other humans, and their reaction to the experiences we provide is what really matters. So if we don't understand what their needs are, if we aren't getting feedback from other humans along the way in an ideating and prototyping and testing standpoint, it's less likely that we're going to do something that they actually value. And then moving on, if we're adopting that design approach, really like leaning into experience mapping and thinking about how do we visualize the touch points and the reactions that we want people to have to all of those touch points along the way. And then increasingly thinking about, okay, how do we layer key performance indicators along these maps, and not just say like globally, like people were satisfied, but really understand empirically as much as possible, like what's working and what's not working along those touch points. Where are the peaks and pits? How do we fill in pits and build peaks? And experience maps can allow us to do that. We can use them to both sort of visualize a future state experience that we want to design, but also to evaluate current experiences and give guidance to people of how to think about the experiences that they want to provide to people. And then thinking about, okay, how do we actually design at that touch point level and go back and say, okay, what are the experience-scape elements that are in play here? How do we want to orchestrate those? How are we thinking about co-creation in this moment? And all of the details at that level to be able to design both at the full journey level, but then also into the individual touch points. And so we have a touch point template that we suggest in the book to do this. I want to actually jump back and just go back to this for one point, because we've talked about storytelling today. And let me just tie into that the good things that have been said about story. I know this is a very story-interested audience as well. From a co-creation standpoint, I think it's important to think about the competencies that our guests, participants, customers have when they come into our experiences. And are there certain competencies that will allow them to extract, to engage more fully and extract more meaning from the experiences that they have? And I think the storytelling competencies of our participants is something that we should consider. We think about storytelling a lot when we're designing experiences, but if we think about storytelling as an experiential competency, I think that's an important piece, right? Because the hypothesis is that if people are more confident in telling stories to themselves and others about the experiences that they've had, that the impact of that experience is going to be sustained and extended, right? And research shows, right? Even just asking people how often they've reflected on a particular experience and what ways they've reflected, whether that's journaling or talking to people or posting on social media. If you also measure impact of experiences over time, it correlates with how long and often people are reflecting on those experiences. And so we started doing some research at BYU that stemmed out of a class that I taught for a couple of years called The Art of Transformative Storytelling with a friend of mine who's an English professor. Not teaching people how to write creative stories, but to tell personal narratives about experiences where they've experienced change. And it's sort of a longer story here, but what we saw with that class is the impact that it had on community building and human connection, which is then spun off to this research that we're currently doing, where we're looking at the neuroscience of storytelling and human connection. So partnering with a linguistic neuroscientist who has what are called functional near-infrared spectroscopy devices. I'm always nervous before I say that because I'm still like, there's a lot of like words in there. FNIRS devices. The quick explanation is they're like portable fMRI devices. So instead of like sticking somebody into a tube and measuring their brain functioning, we can put a cap and a little backpack on them, and they can walk around and do stuff, and we can measure their brain functioning. We can also do that with multiple people at the same time, so we can look at neurosynchronicity and how people's brain functioning mirror each other while they're telling stories. And we think this is a really interesting way to think about extending experiences. If we can design experiences that are story-driven, but also think about the stories that we want people to be able to tell as they leave our experiences, we think it allows us to perhaps do that integration piece that Joe was talking about. So we talked about sort of the defining experiences, unpacking them, a process. I just want to talk a little bit as I wrap up here about where we're thinking right now with Designing Experiences 2.0. And this is a framework that we're using right here. Also a framework we think about with our curriculum at BYU, but to recognize that although people have been doing themed experiences for quite a while, it's been more recently that people have talked about experience economy or experience design. But regardless of that, people have been thinking about experiences for a very long time. There's a very rich, interdisciplinary, foundational knowledge going back to Aristotle and others, thinking about experiences, why they matter, what type of experiences really impact people. And I think in the work that many of you do, it's building upon this foundation from different disciplinary perspectives, right? But from an experience design, and we would say experience design and management at BYU, it's then adopting a paradigm of experiences, what they are, what are different types of experiences, viewing the world through experience lens, then having a really intentional process of how we design them, and having specific strategies and competencies, like theory-based strategies, and also best practices when it comes to how do we help people anticipate, what role should novelty or perceived challenge or story play in the anticipation, participation, and reflection phases, also thinking about competencies. And then that final pillar of staging and impact. How do we implement the plans in a sustainable and feasible and valid way that we've come up with, and then how do we measure the impact, right? How do we measure the return on experience and how it impacts the bottom line? And that's a very nuanced story and big topic that I think there's not just one algorithm that says this is ROX, but I think that is an important story and conversation, and thinking about the metrics that we use with experiences is something that Bob and I are writing about. And another way to think about all of this is that this framework really denotes the components of experience intelligence, which we define as the ability to intentionally design and engage in experiences, right? Because as much as we think about designing experiences for others, we're all participating in experiences. And I think many of us are drawn to this space because we love experiences. We love participating in experiences